We have two more carols with us, so this is going to be a three-carol presentation, and I, at least for one, promise not to sing. Before I introduce my two colleagues here, I want to say that it's really a great pleasure to be able to do this together with my colleague Carol Edelman. This is a topic, today's topic, Beyond Aid, How Philanthropy and Partnerships Can Drive Global Prosperity. It's a topic I think whose time has come and whose importance is undeniable in the world of development, in the world of economic and social change. We know, of course, that unlike 20 or 30 years ago, where public development agencies were basically the lead actors internationally in development, we now have, as the communications experts say, a situation of many to many. Not just public agencies, but private enterprises, philanthropists, venture capitalists, and many other things. And Carol Edelman is going to talk a little bit about the work she's been doing and the very good publications that she and the Hudson Institute have been providing us with data on all of that. So let me introduce my colleagues, and then I'll talk for just a quick moment about how we're going to proceed, and then we'll proceed. Sitting to my right is Caroline Ansey. Ansey, did I say that right? Okay. She's a UK national. She is a managing director of the World Bank. That makes her very important, to us at least, and to many others as well. She's had a career in politics and journalism. She worked as a political analyst for the Right Honourable James Callaghan, a member of the British Parliament, and was an editor of the BBC Weekly Current Affairs Program Analysis. She has also served as a Secretariat member of Interaction, we know Interaction here quite well, the Council, and has been chief of staff at the World Bank, a vice president for communications. She's headed the World Bank operations in the Caribbean. She's been in charge of the World Bank in the Caribbean and a lot of other things. I think for me, in many ways, the thing that we have in common is most important. We're both graduates of the London School of Economics. And so, very warm welcome to Carol Ansey here. Carol Edelman is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Global Prosperity at the Hudson Institute. She lectures, she writes, and she does many other things there. She has really developed a very important publication on philanthropy. I know when I've done research on economic flows to developing countries, it is always, before Carol, it was always hard to find the data. How much funding, how much investments and other things, how much remittances were moving to and from important countries. So I know I'm among many who appreciate the good work that she's done. Carol is a graduate of the MSFS program here at Georgetown University and has a PhD in public health from Johns Hopkins University. She has done a great many different things, served as vice chair for the Atlantic Council. She's been vice chair for the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid, another thing we share, Carol. I did that for a couple of years too. That is an advisory council to the administrator of USAID. She served on the Health Commission. For those of you who ever have had the temptation to dig into all of the advice that was given to the sort of Obama administration before we knew it was the Obama administration on what to do about foreign aid, that was one of the important studies that was done. And she's been involved in a great many other things in the development field. And so, without further ado, what I'm going to do is ask Carol Edelman to talk a little bit about the work she's done, and then to ask Caroline Ansey to talk about the topic of the day. And then we will have a conversation a little bit, and then we will engage you in conversation, questions and answers, and so on. So again, thank you all for being here. You're very brave to come in on such a wonderful day, but I see that intellectual activity is even more important than whatever you might have been tempted to do on the Georgetown beach, frisbee throwing, or just sunbathing and so on. And so that's what we're all about here. Carol Edelman.
Thank you, Carol. And I'm going to stand because I have some slides to turn here, but I think for the most part we'll be doing our conversation from the table. thank you for co-hosting this event with us in this beautiful hall. And I also am delighted to see so many friends that I know from aid and think tanks and NGOs and companies and the World Bank and from Georgetown students and professors. So it's lovely to see you here. And Caroline, thank you for making the time. This is a busy time at the bank with the meetings coming up next week, and also very big decisions on the leadership of the bank, which I'm sure you're all anxious to hear about. And I'm excited because Caroline is going to be sharing some exciting new thoughts and philosophies in the World Bank on results, transparency, and the democratization of development and results. And when I had read much of your interviews and various articles, I was really very pleased with how much of a convergence we had on views. And so what I'm going to do today is just really very quickly point out some of the quantitative underlying trends that sort of support the direction that I think Caroline's work is going, the programs and things that she's done as well. The event that we have today, and I just want to say something about it, really converged with various interests. And the first was the availability of Caroline, thank you very much. And the second was the upcoming Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, which is going to be doing a forum section on global philanthropy. And that will be coming out, I think, in about a month or so. And I was very honored to be invited to do a piece for that, and I know you have a number of other excellent writers on that topic. So that was a fun thing for me to do. And then, of course, the third thing would be our 7th annual Index of Global Philanthropy, which you have on your chairs. And this is our data and our research that we've been doing for all these many years. And finally, we actually reached out for diversity for this panel and came up with 3 women named Carol. So that's our final reason for this event. I want to quickly just share this latest data, and I hope that this can serve as a tool for all of you working in this field, as it has for me and thankfully for others, as Carol Lancaster said, on how the developing world has changed and how delivering assistance and empowering citizens has changed, and with some thoughts on how government aid will need to adjust to this new world. So I'm going to just quickly show my famous first slide, which is, we only have 4 of these, so please don't worry, I will not inundate you with numbers. But this is a very important slide to me because, and it's also in the executive summary that you have, because this shows on the graph from left to right, that's 1991 to 2010, that's the latest year for which we have data. And that is the graph shows all of the financial flows from developed countries to the developing world, from 91 to 2010. And the orange line is, in fact, private flows, and those consist of private capital investment, which is the foreign direct investment, as well as any stocks and bonds that the developed countries buy in developing countries. It includes remittances, which are the monies that migrants send home to their home countries. And thirdly, it includes philanthropy. And so, and the purple line on the bottom is the government flows from developed countries to developing. The point of this graph, and why, because it's so dramatic, and I think it really helps us understand what is happening in the developing world, is that, as you can see, the government flows are, well, the private flows are probably roughly 4 times greater than the government flows. If you look at 1991, you'll see those 2 lines crossing. And what happens if you take those lines back to the 60s and 70s, you'll find that that ratio was just the opposite. It was roughly 70 to 80% government flows and 20% or so private flows. And so what does that mean for how the developing world has changed? Well, there are private recipients of these funds coming in that orange line. One, there are private entrepreneurs receiving investment funds, private businesses starting up, There are private individuals that are getting grants from NGOs throughout the world, or they're high net worth individuals within these countries that are providing this money. There's skilled labor that's available in these countries, ready to receive funds from private sources. I think the other thing in this graph, in terms of seeing how government aid is now a minority shareholder, is that in the mid-90s, and Caroline, you probably remember this even though you weren't at the bank then, there was a time when President Wolfenson was talking about the rise in private investment flows. And I think he probably didn't realize that remittances and philanthropy were also coming up to be such large numbers as well. And he was talking about, he made some speeches and talks at the World Bank on how does the bank stay relevant to this world when in fact there's so much private investment going in. And I know he really started this conversation, and we have certainly watched it progress at the bank to a lot of the programs and thinking and tenets that Caroline is going to talk to you about today that have developed since then, and then over the last 4 years. So the bottom line is major new streams of money coming into the developing world, which were not there in the 60s and 70s. And this is just a quick breakout of what those private flows are. The red line is the private investment, capital investment. You can see that big dip that happened in 2008. That was when the recession, when the market crashed in October. And that actually came up, recovered very nicely. And it is now, in 2010, is $329 billion. So it's now the leading source, leading financial flow, which it generally has been. The green line is remittances at $190 billion, and the purple line underneath that is government flows at $128 billion, and philanthropy is $56 billion. And what's interesting is that how big remittances are, 190 billion. And what we know about remittances is they are going to private families, but there is no argument on their effect on reducing poverty. They have a huge effect on providing goods and services to families. And they also have been, for those remittances where people have come together in developed countries through hometown associations, where migrants have come together and pooled money, there a certain percent of those remittances, not a huge percent, is being used to fund actual development projects in the countries where these migrants, and cities and villages where these migrants came from. Another thing that is not talked about so much is how remittances now are being used as lines of credit for entrepreneurs. If they can show that they've been receiving remittances from their bank, they can get loans on these. We featured some stories about this in previous indexes. They're also used on the macro level for countries that have a lot of remittances coming in. These countries have been able to improve their credit ratings and to be able to get loans at more favorable rates. So I think there's huge roles for remittances that are just starting now, and we're beginning to see some very exciting creative uses of remittances. And philanthropy, though, so remittances and philanthropy together as private flows are 3 or 4 times, twice the amount of government aid. So that will just give you a rough idea of how those break down. And I think I will be anxious for Caroline to comment on some of these flows and what you think about them. But what was, many of you probably read this really amazing, very interesting and remarkable report, update on the World Bank Poverty Report that just came out, whatever, a month ago, or yeah, about a month ago, showing remarkable findings on a broad reduction in poverty in all the regions, actually between 2005 and 2008, where extreme poverty fell in every developing region. And then the longer term view of that was that the percent of individuals in extreme poverty declined from 52% in 1981 to 22% in 2008. So I would like to think, even though we don't have any causal data, that the growth of these flows that has come, and partially it's coming in because there are, the developing world is ready for business now with the skilled labor force and the people to accept it, that has probably had a lot to do with that. And maybe we shouldn't be quite as surprised as we were that the developing world wasn't as affected by the global recession as we thought. Just quickly, second to last slide here. This is the U.S. Numbers, and I know a lot of you are interested in them. And so what you can see here is our U.S. official development assistance for 2010 was the highest that it had ever been. The Obama administration was committed to raising this, and actually the Bush administration doubled it during his 8 years. The U.S. private philanthropy is $39 billion. That's up from 2008. And if you look down, you'll see U.S. remittances are up to $95.8 billion. And they were down at $90 billion. So we had some pretty steady growth from 2009, steady and fairly strong growth from 2009 to 2010, which was on the heels of the recession. And I think and then we had a huge rise in U.S. private capital flows. They were 161 before, or 161 now, and they were 60 a year before. So they came back very high. I think what is interesting to me here is just how philanthropy and remittances really are a steady and stable flow, which really provided a lifeline to the poor during tough economic times. Another interesting thing. So, and then the chart just kind of shows that the bulk of the money is coming from PBOs, $14 billion, private voluntary organizations, or as some call NGOs, and corporations are next, with a large percent of that from pharmaceutical companies through both their philanthropy programs and their donations. Then religious organizations account for an extremely large amount too. We actually did the first nationwide random sample of religious organizations, and I knew religious giving would be high, but I had no idea that it would reach the 7.2 billion that we found in it. So, and I'm sure if we could get those kinds of surveys in Europe, we would probably find a high number, because right now the numbers that we have for Europe, we have collected better numbers for the European countries for probably half of them, but we still are trying to get better numbers for some of them. And even the better numbers that we have are generally just individual giving and maybe a little bit of corporate giving. So we know that number is underestimated for the European countries as well. And finally, on the last slide here, I want to talk about those are the numbers, and what we're seeing is the different mechanisms and just how, what is happening in the world of global philanthropy and resource transfer to the developing world. I think we've seen new mechanisms over the last 10 or 15 years. E-philanthropy, mobile phones, changing the way the developing world is doing business, delivering assistance faster and more efficiently with overheads of 10% on the dollar. Public-private partnerships have been one of those new trends, and cause-related marketing with Starbucks, Product Red, all these programs you've heard of. And basically the term social investment, meaning nonprofit groups in general now are doing a lot of for-profit projects. There's also even newer mechanisms, of which we have here in the audience Susan Raymond, who has done tremendous research and writing on what is happening in the future and how basically the new investment tools coming out, from program-related investments that are done by foundations, impact investing, socially responsible investing, and social stock exchange, are in essence really basically ending the definitions between for-profit and nonprofit, and making this world of assistance giving really open for what anybody wants to name it. So what some of these trends, some of which have been identified by Susan and others from other people. One, it is no longer donors and recipients, it's partnerships, and that is that people receiving money and receiving help are now putting their time, talent, and treasure into the projects. Two, it is a switch from a top-down planning to a more democratization of voice, more demand-driven. What are the projects out there that people are coming up with that fit their needs? They are taking those to development financiers. And whereas traditional aid had been all about the dollars, it's now all about engaged leadership. And this is important because the young donors, as Susan points out in all of her writings, really want to be problem solvers. And they're not really satisfied with, if they can't get a problem done, they want to stay in it and put whatever resources, for profit, not for profit, are needed to solve the problem. And not just as called as have as their exit strategy coming back for another grant. And finally, even corporations are changing from, at least some, and we featured two in this year's index, Walmart and Hewlett-Packard are changing from traditional corporate social responsibility programs to what they're calling shared value, where there's value for both the shareholder and the company and for the community. And it's more than a company just writing a check, it's a company that's coming in and bringing their technical expertise that they commit to the project. And then a final trend or a way of characterizing what we see in this new world to come is loyalty to institutions as being the traditional mode, and a new loyalty to solving the problem with whomever that is that will solve it, whatever institution, whatever group that is, whatever type of funding mechanism might come about to do that. So that is to just sort of help set the stage a little bit for Caroline to come and tell us about some really exciting new programs that the bank is doing, and how you see this playing out in the future against some of these social, economic, demographic trends. Thank you.
Thanks for saving your seat.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Carol, for having me here. Thank you, Carol, for that very interesting exposition. I was asked to talk a little bit about Beyond Aid as the World Bank sees it, and I think it was fascinating hearing Carol there talking about the flows. And I wanted to step back a little bit and talk about what's behind some of the changing flows, and what we see really in terms of a huge shift in tectonic plates in the global economy. And if I talk about the bank, I cast my mind back to 1944. Actually, my mind doesn't go quite that far back, but I cast my imagination and historical knowledge back. When the bank was formed in 1944, we have to remember that developed economies, rich economies, accounted for 80% of global GDP, with the United States accounting for 40%. And those same developed economies, rich economies, accounted for over 2/3 of global trade, even though they'd been devastated, many of them, from the war. If we look back just the last decade, in the 1990s, developing countries now accounted for 20% of global investment and 1/5 of global growth. Today, it's developing countries that are the drivers of global growth. I think this is very important. 2/3 of global growth at the moment is coming from developing countries. They are the engines pulling along the US and Europe. If we also look at some of the forecasts ahead of us, some forecasts estimate that by 2025, 6 major emerging economies, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Korea, and the Russian Federation, will account for more than half of all global growth. And already today, if we looked at China's 32 provinces, and each province is about size of an average US state, they would be among the fastest 33 countries in the world. So that's 32 Chinese provinces. Today, many of you may know, China is consuming half of the world's cement, half of the world's iron ore, half of the world's steel, half of the world's pigs, and a third of the world's eggs. And China is the biggest consumer of minerals, such as copper, aluminium, and nickel. And FDI inflows into China are about 180 billion. That's up from 40 billion just 10 years ago. Now, China's growth will undoubtedly slow, and that consumption rate of all those minerals will peak and fall off because China's having to reassess its growth model. But India will be next. So I think we have to begin to change how we look at the global economy. China's per capita income now is $4,000 per person. If it moves to $16,000 per person by 2030, which is not unreasonable, it would be the equivalent of adding 15 South Koreas to the global economy. So this is a different world we're living in now, and some of the models that we designed in 1944 I don't think any longer fit, and that relates to, I think, what Carol was saying. We also know that it's a very different model because the diversity of the players are very different. In 1944, when the World Bank and the IMF were born, the World Bank was the only game in town for lending then for reconstruction and later for developing countries. We now have vertical funds, the Global Fund for Health, we have Gates Foundation, we have Philanthropy, as you mentioned, we have huge private flows, but private flows, by which I mean private sector flows, can be a little bit volatile. But there are many different players. We have multilateral development banks, we have CSOs. It's a much richer tapestry. But there's also a way in which the old models no longer fit, and that is what we're seeing about South-South development. Post-financial crisis, post-2008 in the US, and 2010-11 in Europe, many emerging developing countries are not looking to the US and to Europe as their models. Many of the movements in the Middle East are looking to Indonesia to see how Indonesia made the transition from dictatorship to democracy. Many of the countries in the Middle East are looking to Turkey for how Turkey had a fast growth program. And we're seeing South-South interactions increase across the world. Colombia's mass transit system being adopted by Peru and Mexico. Mexico and Brazil's conditional cash transfer system being adopted all across the world. In fact, even in New York City, by Mayor Bloomberg at one point. Indian railways in Africa, and of course Chinese investment in Africa. So it's a much, much more topsy-turvy world about who has examples that others want to follow. And I think it's interesting that the South are no longer just recipients of aid, they're also giving aid. And we've seen that 10 to 15% of all international aid flows are now coming from emerging markets, new donors. Just last year, China prepaid 2 billion of its money that it owed us under its IDA, so that money could be lent to other poorer countries. So these flows are flowing south-south. So what does that mean for how we look at development? Carol mentioned some of the terms. I think you said it's lateral relationships, not just north-south. But if we look back on the terminology of aid, when I joined the bank in 1995, the first day when Jim Wolfenson came, actually I worked in his office, we think of the terms, the labels: first world, third world, north and south, developed, underdevelopment, advanced, emerging, donor, recipient, provider, supplicant, rich, poor, them, us. really the language of an older hierarchy that is not borne out anymore by who are the drivers of the global economy. So when we stand back at the World Bank and say, what does this mean for aid? First, it means we believe that we have to move beyond concepts of aid to thinking about using investment, using partnerships to build multiple poles of growth. I talked about the new growth poles that are no longer the US and Europe. That may come back, but we're seeing new growth poles around East Asia. There are many who believe that Africa could be a growth pole. Many African countries were growing at 5 to 6% before the financial crisis hit. Some of them have recovered that growth. It would be in all our interest to see Africa be a growth pole going forward. So how can we use development, investment, growth, poverty reduction, and this panoply of partnerships, South-South learning, down the North can learn from the South, the West can learn from the East. It's a much more topsy-turvy world. So what does that new world look like to us? I think it looks like a number of different things. It looks like development will be much more what we call democratized. Citizens will play a bigger role in their own development, and I'll come back to that in a minute, through voice, through social accountability, through monitoring of projects, through monitoring of government budgets. Secondly, I think knowledge exchange plays a much greater role than simple hard cash. Countries in the Middle East, as I say, want to know what is being done on democratization or what is being done on service delivery in other countries. Montek Awalia, who's the planning minister in India, said, I don't need to know about India. I've got 1 billion people who can tell me about India. I want to know about pension systems in Chile. That kind of interaction around information, democratizing development. I think it also is going to be much more focused on development solutions. I think in the old days we had a tendency to say there is a development blueprint. Some people called it the Washington Consensus. Other people called it other things. We know over time that some countries have made enormous steps to reduce poverty by using policies that don't always conform to what we thought was the blueprint. So I think that idea of developing solutions for particular problems is going to be increasingly important. And then the role of openness, transparency, and accountability. So if I was to say, what would that world beyond aid look like? First of all, the goal would not be about charity. It would be about mutual interest in building prosperity around the world. Secondly, it would have the leaders of the various global organizations like the G7 and the G20 look at what policies could be put in place to facilitate development. So G20 agreements on reducing fossil fuels, on structural reforms, on food security, on investment in imbalances. It would mean investment in new financing instruments. You talked a lot about partnerships. I think we also need to look at new instruments that are being designed. When I was in the country director for the Caribbean and Haiti, a region that is plagued by hurricanes every single year, we invented the first ever regional catastrophe risk insurance pool for countries that get hit by a hurricane, they get immediate payout from an insurance pool. These kind of creative solutions for countries facing problems. I think we're going to have to look much more at remittances. I see my colleague there, great expert on remittances, on what can be done to reduce transaction costs, what can be done around diaspora bonds, what can be done for remittances essentially from funding consumption to funding investment. And I think it's going to mean a lot more look at local currency bond markets, vaccines, investment in vaccines, investment in drug-resistant crops, disease-resistant crops. So a whole research agenda. So coming back to the bank, what does it mean for us? I think the bank is focused on three main areas. One is openness. What does that mean? It means that we believe that to democratize development, all our information has to be open, mashable, interactive, usable by anyone. So we passed the first ever, I think, freedom of information policy of a multilateral institution, and we have an open data policy, which means all our data which we used to sell and make money from is now open. We're also putting all our knowledge, all our analytics online under Creative Commons license. I think we'll be the first people to do that, which means it's the most liberal copyright. I think the second, so openness is an absolute key, because without that open knowledge, we cannot bring in all the players around the world to find those development solutions. And I will give you an example also from Haiti related to open knowledge. After the earthquake struck in Haiti, as you know, there was a lot of structural damage. And we needed, and the Haitians needed to know what could be done about that structural damage. Well, we couldn't get enough structural engineers into Haiti, so we did low-lying flights to take very high-resolution photographs of all the damage, put it on an international website, and over 100 structural engineers from all over the world were crowdsourced to identify what was the structural damage in Haiti and what needs to be addressed. These are development solutions that we've never even thought of before. I think it's new and I think it's exciting. Secondly, accountability. Every agency that is in charge of public money and those in charge of private money, I think have to be increasingly accountable to their funders. And that means we have to be able to put out what results we've accrued, what failures we've had, open the books, and I think that's also, there's going to be pressure on foundations and philanthropy and CSOs to do that similarly. So we are publishing annual results, an annual scorecard of the cost of doing business, the value for money. And along with that accountability and openness, a focus on results. I think in a world of great resource scarcity, everybody's going to want to know what the results are, and so we are focusing on that. Finally, I wanted to say, and this mainly is perhaps brings us back to Carol's point. I think that the nature of development is going to be about partnerships that we've never even dreamed of. And to secure those partnerships, we're going to have to think of an amalgamation of technology with development. Let me explain it. I talked about the crowdsourcing in Haiti. South Sudan, none of the hospitals are mapped. None of their schools are mapped. Crowdsourcing could bring in diaspora to map those goals. Egypt, traditionally the local people have not been consulted on Egypt's development. Now, through social accountability, I think we can work with our clients, and we're doing it, to say, for all our projects, we want to have what we call B supervision, beneficiary supervision of our projects, not just government supervision, not just World Bank supervision, but that means beneficiaries and communities tracking the delivery of aid, saying, using handheld GPS devices to say, did the textbooks arrive? Did the teacher turn up? Was the road built? And these kind of technologies now, very simple, are available, and they're available for philanthropy. They're available for foundations to be able to mobilize local citizens. And perhaps in that regard, I would talk about our last initiative. Now, the bank has evolved, and the World Bank Group, over time. It started lending to war-torn Europe. It morphed into lending to developing countries. It morphed into it acquired a private sector arm in the 1950s. One of the things that we're now going to be launching at the spring meetings, if our board approves it, is a new global social accountability fund, where the bank would begin to put in seed capital out of our own net income, quite political, because it means we've traditionally only lent to governments. Now we're saying we want to use our net income that we make from our middle income lending to put into building capacity for social accountability in our client countries. And that would mean social accountability, building up beneficiaries' ability to monitor their own governments. And maybe on that very last thing, I would say another point on the openness. The bank has recently decided we will not give budget support to any country that doesn't publish its own budget. This is another, I think, effort to say all government, all development needs to be accountable to its constituents. And so making budgets transparent, and we are a member of the Open Government Partnership. So if I sum up, I think what I would say is we need to get away from the idea of aid being about charity. We need to get away from the idea of our being a series of solo players who do not interact with each other. We need to be wary of relying just on private flows. I remember in the 1990s, early 1990s, the bank basically got out of infrastructure because we believed that the private sector would do infrastructure funding. The private sector didn't come in to do infrastructure funding, and so the bank is getting back in terms of public-private partnerships. We have to hold ourselves, all those of us who are in the development business, to very high standards on transparency, accountability, and openness, whether we're private foundations, whether we're public organizations. And I think the citizens in country demand that. I think we also have to look at development as a way of building these multiple poles of growth that can help create jobs here. Demand for investment from the US, it's a win-win, but that can get us out of that north-south dependency relationship that really is not relevant to the world that I described at the beginning. I think we also can, in helping to create poverty reduction investment in what were our traditional aid recipients, help them to become the aid donors of the future. So I would just sum up by saying it's a very different world from 1944. I don't think the aid architecture has caught up, in part because it requires asking some very honest questions about our own future in the global economy and whether we can give up some of the power that went with that donor-recipient relationship. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both for those very, I think, useful and insightful presentations to remind us that we really are in a world that's rapidly changing when we talk about the traditional places that were described as developed and developing, and the traditional actors who were governments and international institutions. And it's an exciting world. I find myself that some of the private sector activities, the most dynamic and exciting parts of it, not as big as some of the other parts, but growing rapidly. I think your shared value sort of concept is, it seems to me, increasingly relevant. So I think that it really is an interesting time. I'd like to just start off maybe by asking, or putting two questions on the table, and letting both Carols perhaps address them. And one is this. This is an exciting world with lots of different actors, lots of different agendas. Is there a problem? Do you see a problem of collaboration, of coordination, of a lot of stirring different pots in the same place. I do have the impression that the institutions engaged in this field of quote-unquote development are not talking to one another as much as perhaps would be useful. They don't have to do projects together, it seems to me, but they have to talk a little bit because they're out there doing a lot of exciting things that are sometimes reinforcing and perhaps other times not. Do we need, in short, a development Davos? That's question number one. Question number two is much more practical. I love the idea of social accountability. I mean, it's not yesterday's idea, but it's something that I think is growing in importance. We all remember the story of Uganda when people posted on the, I guess it was the schoolhouse doors, how much money the government was supposed to be sending to the provinces, and of course the local parents could look and see how little was actually arriving. We realized that there was obviously not just a problem, but also perhaps a solution. But when I listened to you, I think it's a great idea, beneficiary engagement. When I listened to you, I thought about Egypt, which isn't very happy about particularly non-governmental organizations poking their nose around. And Egypt is not alone. And so I would have thought there'd be a real political challenge in some places, not all places, for that kind of very useful innovation. Anyway, let me stop. I could go on with another 15 questions, but I think that's really unfair. Let me stop and let's see whether Caroline and Carol have any thoughts on these things.
Well, maybe I can try and answer that. Too many cooks stirring the pot. Probably fair. A lot of cooks, but a lot of pots too. So I think we have to coordinate both. Do we need a development Davos? I really, my fingers and my toes curl in thought. We have had an aid effectiveness, the Paris Declaration, and the last time we met was in Busan, and we signed up to lots of nice agreements on how we will coordinate. I think there's room for more, but I think it is also a case of all of us having to think, what is our future now in the development space? And I think of the bank, a lot of the bank's future is not just lending. It's not just the money, it is the knowledge. It is the convening of bringing people together. It is some of the openness and the development solutions work. So I think as we all begin to redefine, those people who are into just projects, those people who are into just a sector, those people who are into more supporting government programs as to NGOs, I think we can have a division of labor, and I think that is quite, can be more effective, but I think we've come a long way. I have a double hat. I'm the World Bank Sherpa for the G20, so I go to the G20 meetings. And in the course of that, a lot of the work on infrastructure or other issues, we are drawing up, for example, MDB, Multilateral Development Bank, integrated action plans. That's quite new. So, secondly, on social accountability, I find this one of the most exciting areas. Perhaps it's because I'm a former BBC journalist. I do think that transparency and accountability is so important. And we've geo-mapped now all our projects, IDA and IVRP projects all around the world. People on motorbikes going around with GPS devices to locate a school or a clinic. Can we do it in some countries? In some countries, it's more challenging than others. But we've just had a discussion with all our board members, represents 187 countries. And for our new social accountability fund, what we've said is we will do it in countries where they are happy to have it done. But we can do it, first of all, in the context of World Bank projects. I think, to be honest, I think when you talk about CSOs, some governments get nervous because they think that means opposition groups. When you talk about beneficiaries of projects, most people realize those are citizens. So using first and foremost the beneficiaries to say, is my kid getting the education they want? Did the teacher show up? Did the midwife immunize the children? Most people see the value of that kind of oversight coming from communities. And then on the broader issue, we do consultation around all our countries' system strategies. But I also think the bank has to be clearer, and I think it is becoming that way, in what it stands for in terms of, I hesitate to say conditionality. because conditionality was always a very bad word when it was attached to structure adjustment. Interestingly now, many CSOs are saying to us, please attach conditions attached to good governance or transparency or openness, what's called the new conditionality. But I think, for example, the bank saying we will not give budget support to a country that doesn't publish its budget is the beginning of saying we believe that transparency and citizen participation in projects is good for development outcomes. The bank in our Articles of Agreement is non-political. We're not allowed to get involved in politics. It's very interesting if you look at our history. We weren't allowed to talk about corruption. We were told it was political. We redefined corruption as being about development, which we all know it is. So it's central to our work. We weren't meant to get involved with gender issues. We were told by our board it was political. We redefined gender to be about development outcomes, which we know it is. Investing in women is smart economics. We can deal with gender. We weren't initially. There was some trepidation about us talking about transparency, social accountability. We've shown with our research that those are good for development outcomes. If they're good for development outcomes, ergo they're within the World Bank remit. And I think we, as we go forward, have to be clear about what we think is good for development, and therefore what we need to see in place to be able to invest in it. In other words, it's not just a blank check. The governments sometimes say, no, we do not want to open up. And interestingly, with Egypt now, we're working on a freedom of information policy. And we've done, I think, with about 30 countries now, we've worked on freedom of information. That's a very new branch of work for us.
I think both Carol Edelman and I can talk about freedom of information, how it works and doesn't from our other experiences, but we won't go there. Carol, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll add a few things, and I agree completely with you. When I first presented these numbers to the DAC donor committee of the OECD 6 years ago, I showed them the numbers, and they were already the private giving numbers, and all of them were at a great multiple of the government aid. And so at the very end of it, someone said to me, well, Dr. Edelman, we see that this private giving is so much larger, and we're really perplexed because how will we coordinate it? Well, that wasn't exactly the question that I wanted to get. But I said to them, no, you won't coordinate it. But because we want to see this kind of healthy competition. We want to see somebody try something here, or we want to see a solution geared particularly to a problem so that we don't have one size fits all. And so, but what we need to do is exactly what Caroline said, we need to have this information sharing and spreading that knowledge. So I said, but what you can do, what you do very well, OECD, is you measure. So why don't you go out and measure this and see what projects are working, see what the best practices are. I'm still working on getting them to do that. But I plan to have another conversation with Brian Atwood now, which I'm sure he'll be in favor of this, because there is a role, and I think that can transfer to the role for government agencies. It isn't that government aid, public aid is out. In no way is it out. But it has a new role, and it's a role, as you use the word convener. Convener, a facilitator of resources. The public government aid should work like more like foundations, where there is a competition for ideas. People from the outside with successful projects should come and show how successful those are. Government aid can decide how could we help leverage that, or how could we put you in touch with this person or that person that we know. So this convener facilitator role is key, and it's incredibly important. And then of course, I mean, government aid will certainly always be necessary for terrorism and political refugees and disasters where we need a certain level of aid that comes in. We always will have to recognize that. But I do think that now with technology, this ability to know what's going on with crowdsourcing is phenomenal. I heard that there was amazing work done in Haiti. And I heard that he did this, maybe you know the name, or Dilla, maybe you know his name too. He put a sign up in a village where the World Bank had given multi-million dollars worth of assistance. And he said, the World Bank has given a loan, a big sign, to this city government, which is supposed to build 100 kilometers of road, 5 schools, and 3 clinics. We just want you to know that, so that the citizens could read this. This is really pre-internet. And now look what the internet can do. I mean, people, as long as you invite them, give them a place to report this, this is holding people accountable and letting the beneficiaries say, hey, this is working or this isn't, and this is key. And now we have so many tools now to be able to do that there is no excuse for not doing so. I'll be very interested to see where you take this.
I think we ought to open this up for audience participation in the interest of openness, accountability, transparency, and all the things that we've been talking about here. So I'm going to ask you, I don't know whether we have any mics. Does anybody have a mic? Okay, you've got a mic over there. I'm going to ask you to sort of introduce yourself and then ask your question. So I think a hand went up here most quickly, so please.
I don't think I need a mic. Well,
Mic, please.
My name is Guy Pfefferman. I spent 40 years minus 3 months at the World Bank, so I have a slight knowledge of it. And I'm now, I founded an institution called the Global Business School Network, which is a knowledge dissemination institution. So my question was, since knowledge seems to be at the root of all this, and it flows in all directions. We discovered very, very soon it doesn't just flow from the most south, or from the south to the south, but also from the south to the north. I remember a Nigerian professor who came to Wharton to spend two months looking at an entrepreneurship center, and before he even appeared, there were like 7 or 8 faculty who knocked at his door saying, please can we see Dr. Bamkole, because it's so interesting what's going on in Nigeria. We really don't know how business is conducted there. It goes in all directions. My question is really, what is the structure of the World Bank? Caroline mentioned the word country assistance strategy or something. It's still the country is the building block. And that is inherent in the fact that the World Bank is owned by 100 so many governments. Yet, if you think of knowledge networks and so on, the last thing that they are is national. They're nature global and international, and you put together, I mean, in Haiti, as we say crowdsourcing, you probably had people from 50 countries that were helping. Is that a problem?
Okay. I don't think that is a problem, because I think if we can use modern technology, we can create knowledge platforms that supersede borders. And in those areas where we can't, everybody always says, but look, you're going very high tech, it's all too complicated. What about poor people in villages? Interesting, I just came back from Kenya, where not only 90% of people have cell phones, something like 80% pay their taxi, their shopping through M-Pesa. They're actually using cell phones for payment of things, very small things. And so they have SMS messaging. So the ability, I think, to use knowledge platforms and create global knowledge, I think is very important. So I think that you can have a country focus for some projects. I personally think we need much more of a regional focus for projects. We have a problem in the bank lends to a sovereign guarantee that will get paid back, and what do we do if it's a regional project as opposed to but we do regional projects, it's just more complicated. But for the knowledge, I think the real key here is, as I say, to be as open as possible. And the Creative Commons license that we've just adopted means people can reuse and use our stuff commercially if they want to, as long as they cite the bank as the originator. And where people can't get it on the internet, they can get it through other intermediaries, because now we've basically said it's open source. Then what do we do about making sure the knowledge can be usable. I think in this world, younger people than I am say you have to be careful how much you intermediate knowledge, because a lot of people want the raw knowledge. And I think what we've seen about data is that young people, if you think of Hans Rosling's work, or young people have an incredible demand and appetite for data, out of which they want to they want to reach their own conclusions. They don't want pre-cooked conclusions. So I think the Open Data Initiative helps that. And lastly, I think we need to be making partnerships with partners we've never really partnered before. I think of, they did a crowdsource event, a water hackathon. Actually, we've partnered with this wonderful group called Random Hacks of Kindness, who put on hackathons for good causes. And they did one about how to solve some water delivery problems in Dar es Salaam. And they got people from all over the world, all different countries, who had solved these problems themselves, many from the South, to come in and offer solutions. So that kind of just creating what you call the space and allowing other people to come in. The other thing is, I think that there are a huge number of people who have never thought about development in their lives for the reason that they didn't really have to, but they may be working in Silicon Valley. They may be working in other areas. They love the idea of a challenge to solve a problem with an app. And we have to get all these people who've never really been involved in development to think about creating solutions for some of the development problems. And I think they would be very willing to do so and bring new thinking to our rather, perhaps sometimes, I hesitated to say guy, but old time. We need that new
Okay, can I ask a question to you, Carol, that follows up on this? Sorry, that mess you up. It is related to this because the World Bank has always been a country-to-country organization. And whenever some of us have asked people in the past, well, why aren't you doing this? Well, no, we can't do it because the country doesn't want to do it. And you made a statement in one of the, either, I don't know if it was on a video or something you had said in an interview, that the World Bank was less earmarked, its money was less earmarked, so that we can follow countries' development priorities more. And what I'm asking, what is the tension going to be, if not already, between the bank wanting this openness because we know it's the right way to go, wanting to work more with civil society, and the government's wanting to do something else, and this being their money, so to speak.
I think the fact that we have non-earmarked money is a very important issue for governments. If you think of the vertical funds, they're only going to lend for whatever their fund is, TB, malaria, and countries can get that money, but they have to invest in something. IDA, our fund for the poorest, is available for country programs, so a country can decide what its priority is without earmarked money. It also doesn't, the procurement doesn't have to go to any one shareholder like happens in some bilateral aid programs. I think on the tension, we've always had, if you like, a global public goods agenda. So we're doing a lot of work on climate change, a lot of work on investing in advanced market commitment for vaccine purchases, a lot of work we did on avian flu and other issues that is prior to a country perhaps wanting it. So part of our remit is to do the research, to do the investment, and then create country demand for those programs. But I do believe that at the end of the day, the country has to be in the driver's seat. I don't think you can impose development by fiat. Governments can't usually impose it. International organizations can't impose it on countries, and governments usually can't impose it on their people. Unless there is a broad-based support for that issue, development is very rarely sustainable. And that's why when we work with governments, we try and work with the opposition as well, because you need to have a bipartisan support for the program, because you put in a major education reform, the government changes and it's collapsed. You haven't achieved very much. So as I say, in most of our work now, we find that governments are very willing to move towards, they're trying to move towards a more open government policy themselves. So the Open Government Partnership, I think, which was launched by the US and Hillary Clinton and President Dilma, has a number of key countries that have signed up, Kenya, Moldova, I think Nigeria now. And they want to move in that direction. On the budget support, I mean, that's a classic case. No budget support if you don't have a transparent budget. If governments are not willing to open up their budgets to public scrutiny, more than just because the World Bank has always seen that budget privately to assure us that the money, but what we're saying is now they have to open it publicly to their own citizens. I think that then they have to go and find funding elsewhere. I think that's because, as I say, we have to lend into what we think is an environment that is conducive to development, be it on the side of governance, corruption, or transparency.
Some more commentary or questions? Let's move around. Somebody in the middle here. Yes, please.
Thanks for taking my question. Susan Bornstein from TechnoServe. We've done quite a bit of work with a variety of companies based on shared value partnerships. This is primarily for Dr. Edelman, but welcome every Carol if you wanted. One thing that we're starting to see is funding organizations actually funding multinational or multinational companies to actually provide the kind of technical assistance that NGOs have traditionally been playing. So, for instance, the coffee supply chain, we're seeing a number of coffee companies that have set up their own technical assistance units, and the Gates Foundation, for instance, funding them directly to provide inclusive supply chain kinds of support, totally in a shared value kind of context, but actually replacing the role of the NGO in that scenario. So I'm wondering if you have seen that as a trend, and if so, whether you have any hypotheses about whether you think that's going to continue, and if so, what kinds of companies, whether in particular sectors or types of businesses themselves, which are more likely to do that, to do it in-house versus to outsource it.
Yeah, a great question, and great work that TechnoServe does. We wrote about your wonderful project with Remittances, where you, in Latin America, where you were actually making loans to small business people and against their receipt of remittances, and they had some very successful companies. So I love what you're doing. I think what we are seeing that. In fact, when you go online to the index, by the way, which is, you can download it freely, the executive summary you have is a short version. The index, we featured a little more on the corporate side this time because I'm so intrigued by this shared value and what the corporations are doing. We featured Walmart and Hewlett-Packard, and they are both doing, putting the time of their employees. I didn't get the sense that they were being paid for that, but are you seeing that happening in other companies or?
We're actually seeing companies, so we're the partner with Walmart in the Mexico example that you cited.
Okay, well, we write about that, yeah.
But I'm talking about specific companies that for the first time are actually setting up technical assistance units. So what we're seeing is coffee companies who traditionally outsource that and had partnerships with a group like us or others, where a funder, the Gates Foundation, USA, et cetera, would fund the NGO to provide the services that would be of shared value.
Oh, and they're not
actually
funding.
setting up, in-house technical assistance units to provide that directly. So the NGO is kind of out, and it's a partnership with the funder directly.
Right. Well, I think what I would say is I love this chart, this little chart on here, the loyalty to institutions. So there's less of a loyalty to the institution of an NGO than there is to a loyalty to fixing the problem if they believe that that company, and in the case of these projects that we just wrote about in Walmart and HP, they're phenomenal projects and they're working really, really well. So I guess they're thinking, hey, they've slogged through all the problems of logistics and supply chain management in these countries. So I think we stand a better chance of solving this problem if we use them for that. Now it's possible they might turn to an NGO for another aspect of that project. So I think it just means everybody has to keep their competitive edge going. So I think that the future will be, you'll be seeing more of that. I think it's going to be whoever's solving the problem is going to get the grant.
Carol, I think that there's something else behind this, which is that if enterprises, for-profit enterprises, are setting up their own technical assistance programs, what that means is, and I think we've seen it in our conversations too here with such groups and organizations, that they are actually beginning seriously to move into this space. That they are going to have a demand for the kind of technical expertise, or for that matter, program management, that is implied by a Walmart or a Hewlett or a Coke getting into these into shared value investments. And I think that is really an exciting edge in the development space. So very good. Okay, another question. Oh, I'm going to take a couple of questions if you don't mind. So we have about another 15 minutes. So let's work over here. The gentleman with a hand in the air. If you'll wait just a moment for the microphone, otherwise we can't record your question.
Mike McDonald, Global Health Initiatives. So we've been working in Haiti and on the cholera epidemic. It has not gone well. The money isn't getting into the communities. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is if the World Bank and other institutions like the World Bank would fund big data projects or work with partners that would build big data projects so that we could understand value chains. The monies tend to go from government or donor to the recipient government, but in Haiti that never gets down to the communities. So if we had the ability to see what's going on all around Haiti in many different units, let's say 3,000 different communities, then we might be able to actually understand where the critical gaps are and how to serve value chains, stimulate value chains in which organically there's a growth of sustainability and resilience. Any comments on that?
And let me just take one or two more. A gentleman over in the corner here has been eagerly awaiting the microphone. So.
Thank you. My name is Bob Castro, a Georgetown graduate, former State Department official, and involved in infrastructure projects. Currently living in Cairo, where my wife is assigned to the U.S. Embassy there. You answered my first question about sort of how do we approach technology transfer and human capacity building, but I wonder, because the first report is, and the good Hudson work is data and financial driven, is there a way to quantify the economic value of not just the knowledge transfer, but the know-how in technical fields? You have anecdotal things. Recently, the U.S. Chamber and AmCham in Cairo hosted a suppliers conference. Many U.S. companies are proud now that where they used to have a 1-to-5 ratio of Americans to Egyptians is now up to 1-to-20, thanks to the education and training that they're able to instill, as well as the local universities. When I was at State, we built major infrastructure projects in countries where very often the local labor pool had never worn hard hats or steel-toe boots, and before you knew it, their engineering college graduates had built a state-of-the-art program with building information modeling and those sorts of things. So obviously that's going on, but if remittances are able to be tracked on a financial basis, is there a way that we can start tracking the communication, the uptick in information flows that must be coming when you send a check home? And more importantly, what U.S. interests, companies, are giving, or any global World Bank are giving? What gets left behind that's not purely the financial, economic? Thanks.
Can I take one more question? Okay, I want to see a daring student. I see a lot of students clustered back there. Okay, there's a daring student.
So my name is Nate Barker. I'm a senior here in the SFS. And my question concerns remittances. It would seem as though in academic literature, a lot of the focus is on kind of the other flows, so private flows, ODA, and philanthropy, but it seems as though remittances are fairly neglected. As far as best practices in terms of increasing their magnitude and improving their efficiency, what do you think can be done in the future?
Okay, I think these are directed to both of you in one way or the other. You want to start, Caroline?
Yes, on remittances, I'm going to hand over to Dilip there, who is our expert on remittances. I wouldn't dare speak for him. Let me take the Haiti one, because I think it's really exciting, and I want to go here away and look at it. I would need to know a little bit more. When I worked in Haiti, and I really worked with the under Proval and the lateral tube government. So one of the real problems for the Haitian government is that there's so many CSOs and NGOs, and Haiti's not alone in this, they're all doing good work. Some of them are doing good work, some of them are doing less good work. But so you have tiny islands of great development and some local even prosperity at the village level in a great ocean of deprivation. Because the CSOs are not joined up with each other, the NGOs, and they're not joined up with the government. And a real frustration used to be that the government didn't know what all the CSOs were doing. And as you know, the government in Haiti is absolutely tiny. The budget in Haiti is about the size of a medium-sized US university for a country of 9 million. And so if what they wanted was a division of labor where the CSOs would say, all right, we'll take health, like partners in health in the Central Plateau. So we won't fund that through our budget, it will come with CSOs, but it wasn't joined up. So to answer your question, I would really like to look at, can you look at the value chain? Can you use data to look at the value chains? Which is really a little bit about, can you see where the money's not flowing? And we do it for our own projects because we have to do due diligence and anti-corruption and audits of whether the money, we track all our money quite vigilantly for project money. But let me take that away and perhaps we can have a conversation because I think that would be very interesting. And what you would find out from that would allow you to build better systems in other countries. And I think that evidence-based, country-by-country look and how you can replicate it. On the question about what is left behind, I'm going to let Carol, because you may have done more research about that. I would just say that the bank, there is a lot of pressure right now to measure everything you do, and I believe in it because I believe in results. And the positive side is what you measure, you tend to do. The negative side is there are a lot of things that are very hard to measure that you should do, and the danger is you don't do them because if you can't measure them so well, you can't get funding for them. And in that respect, I think technical assistance, policy reform, the bank does a lot of policy work with governments, reforming procurement policies, transparency that I've talked about. We don't always have a way of measuring all the technical know-how that is left behind after projects or after investments. But let me explore a bit more and see what we could do on that. But Carol, maybe you, from the Hudson point of view, you may have looked at that.
Yeah, well, actually we really haven't. I mean, I do know it, having been in the development field and worked at AID and then some private NGOs, that, I'm very big on trying to get to the impact level, but understanding that if you can't find, I mean, you can always say, well, we vaccinated this number of people, but you don't know if you immunize them. If the vaccine wasn't any good or the child was sick and couldn't take the vaccine. So that we try to get to those impact levels. And I think it first has to be on the projects themselves. They've got to get in there and do it. And I think there's just an appalling lack of evaluation and people taking this seriously. And I found that out on the Health Commission because I did a review of just hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of evaluations, and I was amazed at how they were practically all process evaluations. And there was a lot of money put into this, but it just didn't matter how many people we affected if we didn't know anything about whether we had solved the problem. So we've got to get at the project level first, and then we can try to do something with it. And just on the remittances, and Dilla, please, if you want to say something, grab the microphone. It's an appalling thing that this number right here, my numbers, this one right here, that 190 billion was really not measured before when? By developing nations. Before what year, Dilla?
2003.
2003. Can you imagine that? $190 billion, which is bigger than aid, and nobody was measuring it until we started this and our index, and we discovered your numbers, and we discovered the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, had been looking at us. We need to give them credit for the 1990s, because they were looking at our remittances going to Mexico. So they are to receive good credit for that. But for the rest of the world, it wasn't done. And and I still cannot get the OECD. They publish a chart of numbers with private investment and government aid. And they even have a bad number, but they have a number for philanthropic flows, and I still can't get them to put a line in there for remittances, because they claim that chart is the, all financial flows. So Dilip, you have more work to do on that. But we now use Dilip's numbers because he has a wonderful database and he's doing a great job, and we can compare countries. So thank you for that question.
Okay, maybe we take go one more round. Let's start with Carl Dahlman. Wait till the microphone comes and reveal your identity.
Carol Reveal. I used to work for the bank for 25 years. I've been here now for 7. I have a question for Carolyn. As you probably know, the BRICS are proposing setting up a South-South bank. I was wondering if you can just explain a little bit what's behind that, to what extent they're trying to compete, or why they're unhappy, and what are the prospects. And then another element in terms of the increasing aid in foreign investment and trade, a really big new player is China. And it's playing by quite different rules. And so how is the bank trying to deal with a strategy towards dealing with China, given that it's got such different rules?
Okay, I can see a hand in the back. I think it's attached to a body. Yes, there you are.
I was just wondering, my name is Will Satrin.
Okay.
Sorry. My name is William Satrin. I'm a graduate student from American University. I'm just curious, post 9/11, how have the financial restrictions on flows of money have they had a detrimental impact on philanthropic activities, or has that not been a problem?
I'm going to take 2 more. I saw that Shireen Joshi, one of our distinguished professors, has got her hand in the air. So.
I'm Shireen Joshi. I teach here. I also work at the bank now and again evaluating development programs. My question was about both of your comments about the democratization of development. All of us in the profession agree that this is wonderful. More participation, more local ownership is critical, but it's also messy. We don't understand a lot about, when participation works well and when it doesn't. And there I wanted to make a pitch for, there's a vast number of human behavior questions about, how do programs work at the local level? How do you engage people? Who should participate? And when does it actually become detrimental that need to be addressed before we say it's the solution to how we do these things? So just a comment about that, that the literature is complicated on participation and how you view that would be good.
Okay, one last question. Yes, I'm going to bring the microphone to the front.
Susan Raymond with Changing Our World. One comment, I think it'll be great when we have Yelp for communities development systems, so they can actually review all of the services received and the quality of the people who were sent out there to help them. I think that'll be very interesting. Carol, I have a question for you.
Carol,
You, Carol.
Carol 1.
She's number 1 today. She's number 2. I'm number 3.
Okay, Carol 3. And it's actually about universities, and it's about the preparation systems and structures that we've always had for international development. We have schools of public health, and we have departments of global health, and we have international development programs, and we have all these things. And then we have crowdsourcing. And then we have the collapse of walls between sectors and between commercial and nonprofit, and between management and community. What is the implication of this trend for the way in which universities are structured and the way in which they will be turning out the next generation of leaders in this sector?
Thank you. You want me to go first? Okay. Well, I didn't plant that question, but it's a great question. Thank you for asking it here. Georgetown is in the forefront of the answer. I'm not joking, actually. We are, just to give you a sense of where we are thinking, and I don't know how, I think it may be a little bit out there right now, but we've been putting together a new master's degree in what we're calling global human development. But the concept behind that is people in the development field now are going to be working in different types of organizations during their careers. They're probably going to be working at some point in the public sector, at some point in the not-for-profit sector, at some point in the business and enterprise sector. And so our thought is the way to prepare leaders in this profession in the future is to give them enough background to operate in any of those sectors, the kind of basic things like accounting, financial management, as well as the usual foundation courses. So I think that's one thought. I think I tend to agree with you. The degrees that train people to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a course in agronomy, a course in nutrition, a course in hydrology, I fear are taking the wrong road. That what you have to be able to do is know how to manage programs, find information, find the kind of people you need, be a change maker. And this whole field is a field of massive change. You're trying to make change in this field. But not only are you trying to make change, the field is changing around you, and it seems to me with ever accelerating speed. So I think there's some, absolutely fascinating challenges here. How can you talk to, the chairman of the MasterCard Foundation who's looking for whatever, change makers, innovators, and how can you talk to our colleagues in USAID, and how can you make an interesting conversation with, I mentioned Coke, we just had one last week with Coca-Cola. How do we put all this together and prepare people for this world where you really do have to you have to have the basic skills of operating and managing and finding information and understanding the basic issues, but you also have to be nimble and you have to move around. And I sense, to be honest, this event is a little bit of a piece of that, because what we're doing is exploring here the changes that are going on around us. And I think we're all living in a revolution. I think we all realize that. And if we didn't, our students would remind us of a media revolution, a revolution that has changed the way we all do business in any field. And I think you were talking about that as well. So at a very exciting time, and I think we just have to, we have to be prepared to change what we think makes sense as things move along. I think we have to listen to what people are doing. For me, this was a very interesting conversation. I used to be a professional in this field, but since I started being a dean, I'm a little out of date because they don't let deans go out and play. And I realized when I sort of parachute back in, a whole lot of things have changed just in the last 2 or 3 years that are important. So I think that's an exciting field if you're nimble and able to deal with change and to think out of the box and are courageous enough to take risks. Now, I can't talk about what other universities are doing, but I've probably given some hints. I think universities are not, in my experience, always, they're out there on the edge of change making. And so I think we all have a challenge in university to be able to kind of move quickly if we're going to prepare their leaders in this space. And those leaders, in my view, are not, this is another change, are not primarily from the United States of America or Britain. They're from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America. So that's where we also have to be active and engaged and knowledgeable and nimble. So, sorry, that was just a little bit of an advertisement, but I get a little passionate about this.
That was fascinating. So I will just answer the ones that I think fall within my bailiwick. The brick bank. The brick bank is a very interesting thing, I think. And for many of you know, this is the idea the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, had of setting up their own development bank. Where does it come from? I think it comes from the fact that they don't feel that there is enough investment in some core needs like infrastructure. And part of this is somewhat related to the banks. We have single borrower limits, as you know, and so we're really, given the financial crisis, we're really up against our limit to how much we can lend to India. We found a way of releasing a bond, which enabled us to lend 4 billion more. But India, Mexico, Brazil, we're very much at that limit. And they're saying, well, if the bank can't lend more to us, we need to have perhaps our own development bank in which we would put money. But what they're particularly concerned about is lending for infrastructure. And it's interesting, the G20 has been pushing transformational regional infrastructure. In Africa, you can see the huge difference that could be made around energy, transportation, communications, north-south corridor. But funding infrastructure is incredibly expensive. Funding the feasibility study. The feasibility study is about 10% of the whole. You have to sink it. You don't know whether the project is going to go ahead. And the G20 at one point had talked about having an infrastructure fund, a readiness fund, to fund, and it never came to pass. And I think the BRIC banks want something like that. I'm not sure it'll get off the ground, because I think there are a lot of differences amongst them about what they want out of it, and things like where would it actually be based. I think what the discussions they've been having with us is, can we find more ways of getting capital for some key investment from the bank and others? And we're looking at innovative bond issuances and other issues, innovative finance that could enable us. But we should watch that space. I think it's a very interesting one. And you know, there was the Banco del Sur in Latin America that also was talked about, and Sakakibara in Asia talked about an Asian monetary fund. So there are potentially these things come up. China, yes, is doing a lot of investment in Africa. I'm often asked, is this a bad thing? I don't think it's a bad thing. I think what we want to do is work with the Chinese on some principles around investment, whether they're the Equator principles for the private sector, whether the EITI, the transparency in extractive industries principles. But I think there's room there for our partnering. For example, in Ethiopia, our chief economist, Justin Lin, has just been in China and in Ethiopia. And they're looking at one issue that people talked about is China setting up industrial parks to do manufacturing in Africa. And that not just for the African domestic region, but for export. And they're talking with President Melesh about a collaborative partnership. If it's done well, if it's done with, you know, the rights of the local people, safeguarded and sponsored, I think that kind of Chinese investment in Africa can be good. So I don't think it's for the West to say, oh, our aid budgets might be shrinking, but we don't like the fact that other countries are investing in these countries. I think Africans should have a choice about where they go. But let's work with the Chinese to try and make it socially and environmentally sustainable. I will let you talk about philanthropic flows. Participation, local ownership. I totally agree. It's not an exact science, like very little in development. What we're trying to do for over the next 6 months, we're trying to do this beneficiary feedback. We're trying to put it in 6 very large IDA projects, using different means. In some cases, it will be through SMS messaging. In other cases, it may be people on the ground taking polls of beneficiaries. So we'd like to experiment with a number of different ways and see what works and what is scalable. And it would have to look different in each country, probably going forward. My own sense is that there is no hard and fast, as I say. The jury is still out on what aspect of participation may matter most. I do think M&E, beneficiary monitoring and evaluation, can be important. And I think we do supervision. The countries we support, we send supervision missions. I think it's hard to say beneficiaries shouldn't do supervision and we don't know whether it works or not when we've been investing in supervision and governments have been investing in supervision. The same would hold for our own supervision. So I think that's somewhere we should invest. But we have a very exciting, and you probably know it, in our development research group, the DIME evaluation group, which is looking at project evaluation. Finally, I think I would say about, I want to just say something about scale. Because I think everything we've been talking about here about interventions that may work and may be worth investing in, I think the key for countries is how do you take these things to scale? How do you join them up, like in Haiti, so that they can have a bigger bang for the buck across the country, not just pockets of prosperity, but national programs? And how do you take them all to scale? And that's also where we might have partnerships. Finally, on universities, I would say, I think it's time to take development out of the ivory tower. I think there has been a period of experts talking to experts, and I'm not talking about academia, I'm even talking about the World Bank. But one of the things we've wanted to do in opening up is say this isn't the province of the ivory tower. This is about getting your, it's not necessarily your PhDs. I think we all have PhDs on this panel. It's about also getting your people who've actually had practical experience of what works on the ground. And maybe for the first time, modern technology, or even fairly simple technology, can allow us to do it. So I think it's also, I've always believed that development is actually about the art of the possible. It's what is possible in a context to be done. There is no universality, universal program. And the art of the possible requires, I think, disciplines from across the board and from outside of the university.
Just quickly, we did not see any fall in philanthropic giving with the financial restrictions. Well, we did, because actually we only started measuring them a little bit after, after 9/11, which is when they came on. So it's hard to say whether, they got stronger, or we didn't really have a good baseline for that. But for the most part, though, we've seen that since we started measuring it, we feel we got good enough measures to know we were capturing most of it. We've seen a pretty steady climb in the philanthropic growth. Even during the recession, it only held on to the 2 or 3% increases. It didn't fall into the negative, and we also found that people were giving higher to international giving. Even though their domestic philanthropy may have fallen down, they were continuing with a higher rate to international giving. So, that's what we found on that.
Well, I think we've run over time, and we held, I hope, your attention, and hope you've all enjoyed this and learned something. Thank you all very much. A special thanks to our guests today, and we hope that we'll be able to continue this and other conversations in the ivory tower or wherever we can. So thank you very much.